Today on Life on the X, we're joined by one of the pioneers of tactical medicine, Jim Morrissey. Jim is a former paramedic with the San Francisco FBI SWAT team, founder of the Tactical Medical Association of California. He's also served as the Terrorism Preparedness Coordinator for the Alameda County Urban Shield Training Program and is author of the Tactical Medical Field Guide. Jim has spent over 3 decades operating on the X in high-risk environments, while also helping shape tactical medicine's evolution through leadership and world-class training. Throughout his career, he has taught, served, and mentored countless public safety professionals. Today, Jim joins us to share some of his experiences, the lessons he's learned along the way, and his perspectives on the challenges facing tactical medicine and public safety. It's going to be an engaging and insightful conversation, and we're glad you've joined us. Welcome to Life on the X. Hey, welcome again, everyone, to Life on the X, and I am speaking with Jim Morrissey. Jim, phenomenal to have you here today on Life on the X, and thank you so much for joining us.
I'm totally pleased to be here. Thank you, Sal.
Thank you. There's just so much to unpack with you, but I think the best way to do this is to actually kind of start from the beginning with you and maybe the roots of where you come from and your early trainings and things that you did. So are you a California native or an out-of-stater?
I am an out-of-stater, yeah. So I grew up in the Massachusetts area, and I went to college in Maine. Actually, my first degree was in outdoor education. I mean, I took classes in rock climbing, mountaineering, whitewater canoeing, outdoor survival, stuff that I was totally in love with, and actually got a degree and started working as an outdoor guide after I graduated. And I also became an EMT, and I had a wilderness background. I worked ski patrol. I actually worked as a climbing guide and a backcountry ranger and a backcountry paramedic, as well as a flight paramedic in the state of Maine, and started working for this group called Wilderness Medical Associates, where we were taught, everybody from expedition physicians to, trip leaders at Camp Dandelion, anybody who might have to take people into the wilderness, whether it's a day trip looking for dandelions or a, Himalayan expedition. And so I was fortunate enough to work with an incredible group of mentors and teachers and educators. And I think one of the things we just learned is how to teach, how to take this volume of encyclopedic data of medicine and boil it down to a 3x5 card. And I think, we did that probably better than anybody. And so I think I worked in almost every paramedic field you could think of, except as a firefighter paramedic. I worked on movie sets. I worked on expedition medics, backcountry medic, support for all kinds of different activities, executive protection medic. And so what it led to is I was working with the FBI's hostage rescue team in Quantico. And they're a tier 1, as you know, they're just an incredibly high level proficiency. I mean, they are the badasses of badass in tactical situations, but they go into every different environment you could think of. They could be in the jungle. They could be on the ocean. They could be helicoptering onto a ship in the middle of the seas. They could be at altitude. They could be in the desert. So they really needed training in dealing with all these different environments, and I would add in, quote, tactical medicine. And in the 80s, it was, plug the hole and drive fast. There wasn't a whole lot to it. And I mean, frankly, there's not a whole lot more to it today.
Right.
But so that led me to, I was teaching wilderness medicine out in California, where I met my wife, who's an ER nurse and a Sierra Club trip leader. And I was teaching a bunch of the folks out here. And I couldn't drag her to Maine, so I decided to go to California. And at that very same time, the hostage rescue team guys, who I also taught rope rescue to, by the way, cliff rescue. And, they wanted to have me teach them how to get up inside of an elevator shaft quietly so they could gain access to a floor that might have been taken over by bad guys, or go from one building to another building covertly at night, or cross a river covertly. So all the rope rescue skills I had in backcountry medicine transitioned to a tactical environment as well. And they said to me, "You're going to California. Hey, I hear the San Francisco FBI SWAT team, their doc is leaving and they're looking for another medic." And that was square peg, square hole for me. So when I landed in 1999 in Oakland, the next week I interviewed with the San Francisco FBI SWAT team leader and started working for them the next week. After I got my clearances and all that, I was fully operational. And I think I've been on 350 SWAT operations over 19 years with the team. And that wrapped up in about 2019 when the FBI legal team decided they only wanted agent medics and not civilian contract medics. So it
No
was a good
kidding.
run. A lot of people said I'm surprised it even lasted that long.
Yeah. Well, even back then in 1999, how much was tactical medicine, if we'll call it that, for that period of time, was that um, integrated into the team, even in San Francisco or even nationwide? I mean, depending on the field office or the teams that you were working with, did each team have a physician or a medic that was supporting them?
No, it was actually quite rare. And the FBI team across the country, there were different models. Like I think it was in Pennsylvania, they used the state troopers doing medical support because they're also paramedics. I know in Indiana, the team there used ER docs from the trauma center that deployed with them. So every RA or residential agency or every sort of FBI office that had a SWAT team kind of solved their medical gaps with whatever assets they happened to have. And it was just across the board. Some were paid, some were not. Some actually had firefighter paramedics that were medics. So it was interesting just to see the models that were out there. And in San Francisco, what we used was a contractor. I became an FBI contractor, and I was actually paid by the FBI to deploy and train with the team too. So I did thousands and thousands of hours of training, which was incredibly fun. And I could hold my own with the boys, so that that kept me in good
Yeah.
graces.
I think that's kind of one of the perks of getting on a team. I know, and we'll certainly be speaking of Thames operations in this conversation, but it seems like more and more, the people who are supporting them from a medical standpoint are also kind of, I don't want to say they're integrating, but they're certainly being involved in training. And there have been some instances where they've gone on to integrate with the team, but you were really very pioneer in that way back then. And I think the beauty of what you were doing is that you could almost create a national standard or a new standard for how teams incorporated a medic into their team. Did you find much resistance within the bureau, or was it pretty welcomed for you?
Well, I would say, give me far too much credit. I was just one of many people who moved this ball down the road the right way. But the team was incredibly welcoming, and I think many of the SWAT team members, at least in San Francisco, had a military background. So the corpsman or doc, always called doc. So that's what, there was Doc Morrissey. That was me. And so they're used to having that backup of a medical practitioner that was more than just there to plug holes, was there to take care of them, to keep an eye on them, to maintain them. I mean, I got asked more for Claritin and, Tecnu and ibuprofen than I did for, a chest seal. So
Yeah.
you're, as I use the analogy when I'm teaching people, if you're actually a tactical medic, you're really more like a pit crew mechanic where, you're there in the sidelines. When that engine starts percolating smoke or there's an issue with the vehicle, you come in, you figure it out, you improvise it, you patch it up, you get it back on the road. And ideally, you're trying to keep that machine in high functioning form so there are no problems. It's sort of prevention, early intervention, very much the same kind of premises that wilderness medicine hold true. You don't want little problems become big problems, and big problems become almost unsolvable. So you want to keep problems from happening, and you want to deal with things before they become an issue. Prevention is the name of the game.
It sounds like, and I've had, some experience working with, in my experiences with the Highway Patrol, working with one of our teams. And what I found interesting was that that not only as a medic do you have this opportunity to provide, as you say, that pit crew style of medicine, but you have this opportunity to teach, and certainly team health was always like at the forefront. But more importantly, did you, in your position with your team, or did you find yourself in an instructor capacity in teaching, real good, we'll just say back then, first aid skills or CAB skills by today's standards to agents that were on the team?
Oh, absolutely. They were more than welcome. And I have to thank, I've been through 9 senior team leaders over that career. And every one of them embraced the medical concepts, and educational opportunities. So there wasn't any scenario that we did without some kind of operator down or an injured suspect or an injured bystander or some kind of, medical issue that would be thrown in. And I have to say, kind of related to that, when I first started, active shooters kind of related, although really more of a civilian thing. But I just remember one of the first active shooter trainings I observed, the law enforcement team went in there, killed the bad guys, then kind of high five and said, okay, let's do it again. I'm like, whoa, 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 wait a minute. What about all the injured people? And so there was this, and thankfully there's been an incredibly powerful transition from every officer that I've worked with, fortunately over the last 20 plus years, now understands that, that second phase is just as important as the first phase. If not more important. The threats, as you and I know, are usually over in a heartbeat. And it's really the injured people that need those life-saving interventions very, very quickly. And really even waiting for a true rescue task force may be too late. You want those officers to be able to shift gears into casualty care, not just themselves or their fellow operators or fellow law enforcement, but for the civilians and anybody else who might be injured. So that's been a really incredibly rewarding transition I've seen develop over 20 years. But back to your question. Yeah. And it's been great to see not just the tactical teams, but really any law enforcement, patrol, whatever, realizing that, I live in Oakland. Oakland's a violent city. And I can tell you the Oakland Police Department has put on more tourniquets than EMS in this city, and they shift into trauma care in a heartbeat. They're really good, and they want to save lives, and so that skill set has been just an incredible improvement over 20 years.
Yeah, I think in my own experiences, I've seen this transition of law enforcement personnel who are much more readily engaged in emergency medicine, almost to the point where, certainly from a tactical standpoint, where hey, listen, don't forget you've got to secure the scene before you start working on a victim. But it's great because 20 years ago, the notion of anyone carrying a tourniquet, or even, by today's standards, these very nice compact IFACs, it would have been unheard of. And, I, as a cop myself, I'm like, I don't know if I want to get this uniform all bloody. We have medical people that should be here any time now. But I mean, coming from a medical background as well and having been a medic, it wasn't that difficult for me to engage, but I could see where there was a strong hesitation. Not so much today, where officers are much more willing to engage in that first tier response for medical care, which has worked out really well. So if you could talk me through a normal op, to go back to the FBI, and where does the doc play a role in both, the ops planning, debrief, or the hot wash after an operation has concluded? Where do you fit in that?
Well, that's a great question, and it leads into some really good opportunities here, because with the FBI, of course, everybody's trained to self-care, buddy care. Everybody has an IFAC, can reach it with either hand, so that's really not an issue. There are some operator medics, and I look at 4 different tiers. There's a law enforcement officer who's also an operator. They will tend to default to operator. If they're a breacher or a sniper or an assaulter, they're going to default to that. Whereas if you have a medic who's dedicated as a medic, I think of them analogous to a negotiator. The negotiator isn't kicking in doors and holding prisoners. They're in the Bearcat or in some kind of safe location, and they get called up if their skills and knowledge are necessary. So I always use this rule: the medic is the medic is the medic, and my role is the medic, and that's it. And so the bureau was welcoming to all the pre-briefings, everything. And I would also do a medical threat assessment, especially in rural areas where we're looking at, snakes or ticks or weather or the bad guy pit bull of choice dog, as a potential hazard, or meth labs or chemicals or hazardous materials. So, that's part of the briefing. And I will say, I've supported other law enforcement teams, and the Bureau is extremely meticulous. They do their homework. There is a weeks-long process of investigation, collecting photographs, overhead, blueprints of the home or the target location, the office, whatever it happens to be. There's a whole PowerPoint thing we did in the morning that would take about 45 minutes that would go through the choreography down to which seat which people are sitting in and which vehicle and which order. extremely detailed and choreographed to the point where there was very little surprises when we hit the target location. Now, what I did would not only be, quote, the medic, I would be the liaison to the local advanced life support ambulance that we would have standing by. So we had a F-350 as a covert ambulance. That's an FBI vehicle that we could move an operator, but we're not going to move a subject or a civilian. That was really for operator or fellow LE, law enforcement. So I would notify the local ALS entity, whatever operational area we're in, and coordinate with them. And I would meet them at our forward staging area, and they would be invited into the briefing. We're not asking them to say anything, just, hey, we want to embrace you and allow you into the briefing with all the details. And then I would make sure we have comms with them, and then we would stage the ALS rig. And, we did this down in LA or all over the state with the Bureau. And I would stage them, a block or two away. So they're like a minute out, but they're in a safe location, where I would roll into the target location and be in a separate vehicle with two FBI operators who would basically be my escorts and protectees. So I had, kind of my own bodyguards, if you will, and be brought in under escort when the time happened, which was actually fairly often. And so if we did have, and I can tell you way more times than not, it was not an operator injured or law enforcement or a canine. It was the subject's grandfather, or maybe the flashbang was too close to the crib and the kid's having an asthma attack or whatever. So, medic up, and I would go in and do an evaluation. And then once we were code 4, basically scene secure, say, okay, we can roll in the local unit. And then we would, I'd have direct comms with them, would roll in, would do a patient transfer. And then basically it would be their EMS call. And all I would have done is an initial assessment to determine that this is, legit. As you know, there's a lot of times in perpetrator, bad guy nonsense that you have to deal with. But every now and then something's real or others. So that would be a pass off. So that model worked very well. It still works today. And I think there's one layer in between sort of the embedded medic that I was in the ALS standby, and that's a TEMS unit. And the TEMS unit, is ballistically protected. They're a little more squared away. They're used to working in that environment. They train with the LE team. So they're sort of that, they're not really part of the team, but they're not like a standard ALS unit as well. And that's, I think, where we are today with TEMS units, which I think is a good niche for that role and need.
Can you at all, Jim, maybe relate to or describe an op that you were involved in where all these things came together, where, whether, all of a sudden you got a medic up and, whether it was one of the team guys or a suspect or otherwise, required a high level of intervention of medicine, and all of a sudden everything is moving in a very rapid pace to exfil that person off the scene, off the X, so to speak?
I would say, as I was mentioning earlier, the Bureau team that I was fortunately enough to be associated with was so squared away, so dialed, so choreographed. There were really in my over 300 SWAT ops, were any serious traumatic injuries other than some orthopedic kind of things, sprained ankle, dislocated shoulder, that I could deal with a little more calmly. The more urgent things were actually, like real MIs on the person's grandfather, where we had to stop action and there was still, the whole house was not cleared. And so medic up with a protective envelope. And then basically, and I think it was in LA, we used to go down to LA probably 3 or 4 times a year to have these big ops where they're hitting like 20 places all at once. And so, there were a number of times where it was getting them off the X, getting them out to a safe area where the building isn't even fully cleared yet, and transfer it to ALS care. And a couple of times we actually moved the patient in our covert ambulance to where the ambulance was, because it wasn't quite safe enough for them to be brought in, and we weren't code 4 yet. So we had to move the patient out.
How ALS were you, ALS capable were you in your position?
Well, that actually, interestingly enough, we decided that we had a medical director, so we were able to do some frontline meds and things like ketorolac. We were able to give, as a IM injection, sort of like super duper ibuprofen, albuterol, nitro, epi, Those kind of meds we were able to do, starting IVs, but we didn't have full 12 lead, at least back in the day. I'm not sure where they are now, but we had an AED, and certainly O2, ventilation, suction, sort of the basics. So it was really sort of almost more of an intermediate EMT level. And I not in any FBI operations was I required to do any serious interventions like a decompression or a surgical airway or something along those lines. So and as I said, the Bureau is pretty squared away. They just don't let those things happen.
One of the things I've noticed, and I don't know if you have as well, but I don't know whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, or whether we can certainly get to a point where we can train people to a more precise level of assessment and treatment where, we immediately will have people applying a tourniquet, excuse me, or a chest seal, which is fine, in the presence of a penetrating chest trauma. But like this immediate notion of like, I've got to bring out a 14 gauge and decompress them. Do you think that we've almost gotten to a point where now we're just treating based on not necessarily understanding what we're seeing, but just treating because we think we know what we have? And this is more at the basic LE level, not so much at the TEMS level.
You absolutely nailed it right on the head there, Sal. That is we had one case locally where a local law enforcement officer decompressed a chest, and they were kind of high-fiving themselves, doing, and, the ER doc who did the evaluation said, I don't know if they survived because of the decompression or in spite of the decompression, so it's one of those tools that's there. But even back, when I was teaching with ISTM in 2008, 2009, I don't know, for 5, 6, 7 years, whatever I did, or maybe even more, I always had hesitations to see an IFAC given to an 8-hour class to a law enforcement officer with a decompression needle. I've always respected scope of practice. Scope is scope. Scope is scope. If you're not authorized to make an airway in somebody's neck, then you probably ought to not do it. If you're not authorized and trained and certified and under some medical control to do a decompression, then you probably shouldn't. So I am definitely one. I'm not always a rule follower. I get yelled at by people all the time for going out of bounds. But in the medical world, I want to stick with that. And I think you have exposed an area that needs to be addressed. It's really about assessments, and really knowing when time is more critical than you have the skills to deal with. It's that quiet person with a penetrating wound to their belly that says, "Hey, I'm fine. Go look at the rest of the kids." And they're the ones whose liver is bleeding, and they'll be dead in 4 minutes if you don't do something about it, maybe 10 minutes, whatever.
Yeah.
So it's really about assessment and understanding. Again, a wilderness medicine concept is you want to know what the problem list is, but you also want to know what the anticipated problem is. If it isn't fixed, what might this lead to? A tension pneumothorax, hypovolemia, intracranial pressure increasing, whatever the anticipated problem is. And if you can't fix that anticipated problem, then you got to get them to somewhere that can.
Yeah. And that's the difference between urban medicine and we'll just say mountain medicine or, more remote medicine where, you have to plan the long-term care based on a really strong assessment. And so much of the time in an urban environment, the ambulance is going to be there within a minute or two and you're going to get everyone loaded off and gone. So it leaves a lot of room for, I'll just say, mistakes that could be passed off and not seen. And, but you also make an exceptional point in that, whether you're at a BLS level or an ALS level, being able to identify injuries that may come with, like you say, a hot belly or just something that's suspected. Just because a bullet goes in a particular area of a body doesn't mean that's where it's at. The path, the travel of that bullet, can affect a number of different organs. And depending on who the patient is, it may be slow coming or may be more immediate. And I think those are one of the things that we like to, describe when we train now, both law enforcement officers as well as people who are in ALS and BLS, because it certainly changes things in a tactical environment. When you mix someone who was, as an ambulance paramedic for a number of years, I knew I was working in a controlled environment within my little chaos, but it was secure. I wasn't concerned about other things. But when you're working in a kind of we'll just call it a warm zone, or maybe something that's even more tactical, um, you've got to be really precise, and you've got to be able to move and think quickly, even if you're at that BLS level, and understand what it is exactly that you have, and how much more that needs to be done before you get off the X and get down the road. I think that you also brought up a very good point. I am truly a guy, scope is scope myself. And you and I both share a similar opinion. In the position I am with now with the International School of Tactical Medicine, um, I don't see any need for placing 14 gauge needles in an IFAC that's going to be going to someone. Mainly because even if you do it and it's within your scope, your normal scope, it doesn't mean that you are under the authority to do it at that moment. And so much of the time, we have people doing things, I think, that like you're just hoping to get a pass with it, especially if you haven't done any significant harm to them. But there's definitely a medical legal aspect of everything, including tactical medicine, that people have to kind of understand and respect, because the liability is pretty great when you don't.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up some really good points. And as you know, the last few years of the legal implications of medical care, not even in a tactical environment, but certainly, when you're working with law enforcement, if somebody is restrained or under arrest and they're including medical care, one has to be very careful in understanding that, hey, you are being recorded no matter what you do, what you say. And so you want to be almost overtly, not performative, but you want to be a patient advocate in every possible way that you can, and saying, I think this person would have a better time breathing if we put the cuffs in the front. As long as we can do this, let's do this safely together. We really want this person. You need to be a patient advocate, and not, lose your 360 posture, perimeter security kind of angle. But you know what? I always felt like when I got called medic up, I didn't really need to have a red light to do my assessments. I've got SWAT guys all around me. I want this thing lit up like a surgical suite, and I don't have to have my quote head on a swivel, watching out for back. I got SWAT guys all around me. Like I'm the mechanic. I got to get my head in the engine and figure out what the hell's going on here.
Yeah.
And so I did not and I see a lot of the tactical medical trainings, you got to keep your head in the swivel, and keep your posture ready to exfil, ready to find cover, concealment. Okay, there is a microcosm of where that is really appropriate. But once the bad guy's put down or the scene's secure and they're calling medic up, be a medic. Just do your job, be a good medic, and decide big sick, little sick, what's the next course of action. Part of my planning was always, okay, does this need to go to a trauma center? Speaking about mostly operators, or can this go to what I call little hospital? Maybe they need sutures or an x-ray. Or can it wait till tomorrow? I think you got a sprained ankle, probably worth getting an x-ray. We don't have to do it tonight. We're in the middle of Turlock, and maybe you want to get back to the Bay Area and have your own doc look at it. So there was always those decisions about, you want to be conservative and not blow it off. But you can also help them make decisions that make the most sense based on the circumstances and the medical condition that presents itself.
Which kind of leads me to, this whole TEMS concept, and what we're seeing most often. In fact, we still conduct a 1 week advanced tactical medicine class, and the last class we had, half of the students of 44 students were firefighters who were being sponsored through the local UASI, as they are forming TEMS teams within the UASI, Sacramento UASI AOR. And so, I think it's so important, to ensure that those TEMS personnel are being trained in a consistent manner. Do you see any drop-offs, or is there some notion of how a TEMS program might be framed in your mind?
Yeah, and I've certainly seen the evolution, and I've been lucky enough to be asked to help develop TEMS team around the country, and also, I mean, internationally as well. So, I've been overseas and seen many of the team development there. But I think, a TEMS team should be part of the local EMS, authority. They should have, they should be accredited paramedics or EMTs in that AOR that they happen to be working in. That just makes it a whole lot easier. So now, if you do have an operator with a significant traumatic injury, they can do the assessment. Okay, this needs to go to the trauma center. Let's go. They can roll in the same ambulance. So you have good experience, squared away, dialed, vetted paramedics as part of TEMS team. At least in Alameda County, Falk, which used to be AMR, then it was P plus, then it was whoever else, and now it's Falk. But they're really good. They're good paramedics. They have EMTs on the team as well. They train with the local law enforcement, so they know who's who. They know who to talk to, who the TL is. They're invited, into the ops briefings and whatnot, and they show up. So if they get a call, say, "Hey, we got an op at 4 a.m," they'll send a team there. It's a little different in the fire service because I can't blame a fire chief to say, "Wait a minute, you're going to send a whole engine company." And you're going to stand by for 8 hours for call out and dogs and robots and surveillance and drones and be there all day and have to get pizza. I don't want my teams there. I'm going to have to pay them. So there's definitely an issue there, which I've seen a lot of, the fire department is great at the rescue task force model. You're on duty. You get a call, you're on your way to Safeway to go get dinner, prepped, and, there's a school shooting, you roll in, you put your ballistic vest in, you get your RTF team ready to go. Okay, that's exactly it. TEMS is a little different. You're basically there as the kind of pit crew mechanic for the tactical team. It's almost like being a fire line medic a little bit. You're there to support them, and you could be there for a long time. And so that I think becomes the bigger issue is, at least with the Bureau, it was, 20 flashbangs and proned out and we're offered the breakfast in 20 minutes. A lot of the shift now is surround and call out, and it could be there for many hours. And, the fire chiefs, obviously are not going to want to support that over and over and over. There are some hybrid models, like Berkeley has a really good, they can't call it a TEMS team there for some, political reasons. So it's a medical support team. But they work very closely with BPD, the police department. They deploy with them routinely and they're squared away and they work together. They train together. So as long as they do that, I think that's a good model. Now, back when I started this whole thing, there were no TEMS teams. So it was a regular ALS ambulance, which worked. I mean, that they're good paramedics and we transferred care to them plenty of times. So I think it's at a good place. You may bring this up at some point about whether they should be armed or not. And I'll flatly say, no, they should not be. Okay. But we can talk about that later at a different thing, unless they're reserve officers, different category. So, I think they got to remember they're the medic. And, as long as I stay in that role, and I think I always respected the TEMS team that showed up at the briefing and didn't say anything. They're quiet. Once you start getting this individual says, well, have you guys thought about being hydrated? And, it's going to be really hot out there. So make sure you're doing this. And everybody got sunscreen, start pop, 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 pop. Nobody wants to hear that. Shut the F up. Quiet down. Stay in the corner. And I'll call you when we need you. So you got to have your act together. You got to have your kit together and just be there and be ready to spring into action if you're asked to.
It's interesting you say that because on a couple of occasions, and I won't name the agencies, but we certainly, have had some agencies come to our courses and they've already made some move to arm their TEMS personnel. And it's kind of like that, scope is scope. You can't just decide to call yourself a law enforcement person because maybe even you have a CCW, but you're now operating within this law enforcement group carrying a weapon. It is probably the most dangerous thing that you can do is to put a weapon in the hands of someone who isn't well trained any more than, handing a law enforcement officer, a laryngoscope and an ET tube and say, go ahead and tube them. Like, well, I don't really know what to do, but give it a shot anyway. I think that I've also seen where a lot of well, one in particular up in Shasta County. I don't know if you're familiar with them, but they actually embedded two of the local medics into their team by first sending them to a modular post course and getting them level 2 status as a law enforcement officer, and then sending them to the 80-hour basic course, SWAT course, and then putting them on the team. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I would say that's getting a little more palatable. They went through a reserve academy. They went through an 80-hour SWAT school. There's certainly plenty of shooting and vetting and, okay, this person either knows what they're doing or not. And then to maintain that skill. So I don't have an absolute problem with that model, but I think this idea of, the firefighter medic who's on the Thames team, and they do a little bit of training and they allow them to carry a weapon because they have a CCW, even a legitimate shoot is going to be scrutinized nationally. And a good friend of mine who's also on our FBI SWAT team as a medic, he's a flight nurse. He's also an EMS attorney, extremely knowledgeable. Michael Balls, he's awesome. So when we do our tactical medical technician class, he does a full lecture on the medical legal implications of being a Thames medic. And there's a lot to think about. And certainly he's of the opinion, as I am as well, unless you had trained with the team, you have reserve, you've been to the SWAT school, you shoot regularly, you're just as good, if not better, than the best shooter on the SWAT team. Even then, your weapon is only if all hell breaks loose. It is not an offensive weapon. Even that, I like I said, I can digest that a little bit more. But one has to be very, very careful with that whole opening that can of worms and and going down that road.
Do you feel that someday there's going to be because if this is ever going to turn in a direction that, well, we'll just say that you don't necessarily favor, but I have questions about, instead of having a bunch of rogue Thames operators out there, why hasn't this become more of a legislative opinion and ensuring that there are guidelines and restrictions for the exact requirements for even getting to that level, if it should be done at all?
I agree. I was on the initial EMSA and post statewide tactical medical advisory committee where we came out with, I thought, some very good guidelines. And it's been revived last year. And for some reason, it's been put on a temporary hold, and I'm not really quite sure. Sure why. I think EMSA and Post both had a lot of legislative priorities that they needed to address. But I think that is the place, as it really needs to be both a post, so it's a law enforcement, as well as EMSA, an EMS kind of overlap that comes up with, like, what is a Thames medic? Let's define that. And unfortunately, in the state of California, there are, 52 some odd protocols that are out there, 52 medical directors, 52 some are very similar and some are really different. And so, that I think is more of a problem than a help. These isolated kingdoms of influence, I think is a detriment to emergency medical services. In the state of Maine or many states, it's a statewide protocol. Now, granted, Maine's a whole lot smaller, but it's a statewide protocol. So no matter where you go in the state, everybody does the same thing, same expectations across borders. So that I think is part of the problem too. And, as we've been discussing, some are firefighter-based medics that are volunteers, some are paramedic, full-time paid, some are private 911 contract ambulances, some are civilian contracts, some are law enforcement medics. So there's a lot of different models. And I don't know if we're going to be able to fix that, but I think it is a problem that I would like to see fixed.
Well, I mean, and you've hit the nail on the head. That is probably the singular problem. And it's it's no one's fault, really. You have a big state with a kind of a wide geography, different locations. And so you've got all these LEMSAs, as they're referred to, these local emergency medical service authorities and their medical directors, and a statewide EMSA that just doesn't have the ability to create kind of an overarching authority to everything. And so they put it into the hands. I kind of, it's analogous to our federal government and state governments. You have this federal level of government, And then all of a sudden, each state kind of does their own thing, states' rights, so to speak. And so those LEMSA medical directors, come up with some kind of weird stuff, depending on which LEMSA you're operating out of. And so the notion of TEMS probably has hardly been addressed by them because they've got so much else on their plate. And I think that the state EMSA is probably very hesitant to even try to address it as well because it's too big of a fish. And in integrating it in within the post catalog and the things that post would want is going to make it very, very difficult. But before it gets out of hand, I feel like there should be a better notion of how it should be both trained and conducted, across the state as opposed to each individual LEMSA.
Yeah, I fully agree. And, I think there is interest in doing that. I know the folks that I've been working with on this recent revision of the statewide tactical medical advisory committee, they're all really good folks, very knowledgeable, very experienced, all come with their own perspectives. And I think there's some low hanging fruit about first responder operations, kind of analogous, like, rescue task force kind of stuff. So every law enforcement officer, every firefighter, EMT, every basic EMT working on ambulance, they all get some level of training, mostly focused around active shooter response, and so that's kind of the low hanging fruit where we want to be consistent with that. Then that next notch up is really the TEMS group, which, is a little bit undefined. And then the higher tier, is the tactical medical specialist, been through, the 80-hour SWAT school, been through a ton of training, has a lot of experience. That's kind of the cream of the crop. And there's not a ton of those individuals out there. And I was fortunate enough to be in that role with the Bureau, and you have a unique background of being both, paramedic, medically savvy, but also the law enforcement side. And, could blend that, those two disciplines, cleanly. And that's not easy to do.
I'll tell you what, I find myself almost serving two different interests and then telling myself, hey, listen, you can't do both.
Right.
I mean, you can certainly try to integrate both, but at some points you got to decide, am I a cop or a medic? I used to say, I remember in 1989, when I originally got assigned to H-20, one of our helicopters in Sacramento, I landed at a scene and there I was, and I'm wearing this shoulder holster and I'm working on this patient. And one of the fire guys said to me, goes, "That's the coolest job, man. You can shoot someone and treat them at the same time." I thought, well, I never really look at it that way, but I suppose so. But it really requires a lot of thought, especially it seems as if we need a greater presence of medical response, not only within a law enforcement team, but just in general to all types of episodes that are going on. And which kind of brings us to this RTF concept. What are your basic understandings and maybe, your thoughts on how RTF, because it is run differently. I'm sure you're probably familiar now with the more, like there's almost a split concept of a rescue corridor versus, more like a quick reaction force team of, 3 and 3 or 4 and 3 cops plus medics just going to a spot, going and bringing them out versus just kind of securing an entire large area so people can go in and out. Any thoughts on that, Jim?
I have a ton of thoughts on that. I've probably written 15 articles on this very topic, over the years for Police One, GEMS, EMS One, Fire Rescue One, so I've really been involved intimately in the evolution of, sort of the RTF, concepts and whatnot. And, I think where we're at now, just to kind of jump ahead to where today's date is the diamond formation, if you will, that's sort of that protective envelope, almost like a dig pro model, has a place, but it's more of a specific choice of strategy depending on the environment you're in. For example, if there's like a mall, multiple shooters, you don't know where they are, there's injured people in Foot Locker and in, Friendly's ice cream, and, we're moving down, like that diamond may make sense. So you can move that medical capability into a long, continuous kind of corridor where you're hitting up multiple patients. But that situation is pretty rare. I mean, it's kind of like the Mumbai, where there's just lots of people all over the place and bad guys are still around. And maybe the RTF shouldn't even be there in the first place. So, but saying that, I think where we're at today and where we should be is that, LE moves in first and they are looking for the shooter. They're trying to eliminate the threat, which may be already taken care of, self-administered, or they fled the scene or whatever, or they engage with civilians or with law enforcement. So, we know statistically that it's over in a heartbeat. There is no more bad guys, and it always used to bug me is when we do scenarios that I'd be an observer at, where after 10 minutes, a second bad guy comes out of the closet and shoots everybody. Or, and then Jack in the Box, an IED pops out of nowhere and blows everybody up. Oh, you're all dead. That just doesn't happen. So let's focus on probabilities, not possibilities. So I think, the shift has heading in the right direction. And I've been a big advocate of that. First wave of cops is dealing with that threat. That second and third wave should be focused on casualty care, either making a secure corridor or getting those kids in that cafeteria out to a cold zone or initiating that life-saving care. And you don't need, I used to work scenarios with Tom DiTomaso. He was one of the bigwigs in Black Hawk Down, very well respected. He was a Delta operator. So I was fortunate enough to do many exercises around the country with him. I just remember him like yelling at these SWAT teams going, dudes, you don't need 8 effing guns pointing down the corridor. The guy's been dead for 20 minutes. You need 8 guns. Put 1 gun down there and get the rest of you guys getting these kids over to the area where you can treat them. And so, that was instilled in me decades ago. And, you don't need 8 guns pointing down the corridor, and so I think that shift really needs to be of those 3 things. First wave of cops dealing with the threat. Second and third wave, establishing a corridor. And I think of the dog bone analogy. If you think of a dog bone, there's the CCP, if you will, where most of the casualties are. There's a corridor out, and then there's a transport area or an external CCP where you're going to move the patients to get them off. So that dog bone needs to be secure, a safe corridor. And then I use the term free range medics. Then the medics can go in there and it's an MCI. And I usually see, even in hundreds and thousands of exercises I've done, even in that model, the medics will stop at the first patient, collect at the first patient, and deal with the first patient. And I kind of want to see a little bit of a shift more to go deep, see what you got, and then make a plan from there and start dispersing your resources to deal where more the critically injured patients happen to be. And so that shift, and even NFPA, which is slow to move, their posture, they call it a protected island. Okay, I think that's a silly term, but all right, protected island. go to your Gilligan's Island and call it protected. That's great. Whatever you want. But that model makes some more sense. And actually, I wrote a recent article that I was going to call, enough of the bus stops. And by bus stops, I mean sometimes in an active shooter type situation, there'll be an internal CCP or multiple internal CCPs. And then they get evacuated to an external CCP, and then they get moved to a treatment area or triage and treatment. Then they get moved to an area that's transport and loading. And I call all of those various things bus stops. And if you want to get the express train to the trauma center, you don't want to be stopping at every bus stop. You want to recognize from the point of impact, the point of injury, and from there, this kid's got 2 gunshot wounds to the chest. He's okay now. He's not going to be okay in 15 minutes. So he needs to go past all these bus stops and get on the express train to the trauma center. So that's kind of, in a nutshell, kind of the shift that I think is happening appropriately.
Well, I mean, what you just described just made me dizzy. I mean, I don't think that's part of any ICS model that I'm aware of, but we're overcomplicating, and I understand that part of the problem is that we have, we'll just say turf wars is how I sometimes see these things going down, and everyone wants to be in charge. And when you don't have a strong unified command, it's going to break down. And from my perspective, especially if we're talking about RTF and those initial in a small event, kind of like a SWAT response. By the time the CCP or Unified Command gets established, the party's over. And I mean, you can certainly create your own little ICS within that response, but trying to create that large envelope really requires like time, as you said from the beginning. I mean, 6 to 8 minutes, things already happened. Things have, you could have people out, and how long does it take for someone to unfortunately die from, exsanguination? You've got to get them off the X. You've got to get them, immediately addressed there on the X and off the X. And when you mention this notion of um, officers becoming caregivers, if I understood you correctly, I'm 100% agreement, which is why it's so important for us to ensure that the level of competency amongst our law enforcement community is at or at least at, but maybe better than some of the EMS personnel that are going to the same event, because the only way to potentiate life saves is to make sure that everyone can do at that very basic level some of the things that will save a life, based on just CAB type injuries. Um, I always am confused when, we know that there are reports of one shooter and, a contact team has already been formed and they're already downrange going toward the sound of gunfire, et cetera, where like you would need a second contact team or a third contact team. To me, those, even if you don't have EMS already on scene, for whatever reason, you're in a backwards location and they've established a, kind of a safe zone, and staged a mile back and no one has shown up to help you. Why can't those law enforcement personnel be their own RTF? Does that make sense to you?
Absolutely. 100%. Yep. And I think even if they're a little over aggressive on putting tourniquets on people that don't really need them, yeah, I don't have a problem with that as long as they get reassessed somewhere in a more safe zone. And, we're really strong advocates these days of transitioning away from the tourniquets that probably didn't need to be put on there in the first place. But so be it. No points taken away. I look at a tourniquet like you got a leaky faucet and your sink is squirting to the ceiling. Go underneath and shut the valve off. We'll figure it out after we, get to I find my tools, I get my washers and all that. So, so yeah, I think that second and third wave of officers need to defocus from threat elimination, neutralization to more ensuring the scene is secure. A 360 posture always makes sense. And you need, 4 or 5 guns doing that. But the rest of them, like even in the Navy shipyard in Washington, there were 197 officers that responded within an hour. 197. Everybody's going to come out of the woodwork, even in a rural environment. Every school resource officer, detective, CHP, anybody who lives in the area, they're all going to roll to that school or to that church or to the hospital or wherever else the chaotic scene is going to be. And, as you pointed out, the gap that still exists is this centralized, unified command. I mean, I rolled up in a support mode in my job as an EMS coordinator to a shooting at a school in Oakland. I rolled in maybe 20 minutes after it was, and sure enough, there was a little fire incident command post. There was a Falk medical EMS command post, and there was a law enforcement. And I knew everybody. I'm like, why aren't you guys have been through so many trainings that we've done together. You've been through Urban Shield, SWAT Challenge. We live each other. Why are you in these little pockets of isolation? And as you said, it's about culture. It's about collecting with who you know and who you understand. And, maybe there's a little concern about, I don't want to be that guy walking into a LE team and, start asking questions. So, there's still that going on. And, but I should have taken a picture. It was like, you guys should know better. This is, I thought we were past this, but it's people default to their comfort zone.
Sure. I think, and I don't try to attend a lot of, full scale exercises, FSEs, but, because I kind of walk away disappointed. And it all starts with the most basic things like comms. And so when you talk about like all of a sudden you have multiple command posts, I feel like part of the problem is that no one can communicate to each other, and which is where the first breakdown begins. Do you see that at all?
Yeah, I mean, That is, the fire folks can talk to themselves. They can talk to their own dispatch. The private ambulance provider, same, they have their pipeline to their own dispatch. LE has their own pipeline. And, that's, interoperability is not the answer that you want everybody on the same comms or the same channel. There's problems with that. But you've got to have some, even if you're kind of bumping bumpers back to back with a fire, battalion chief and a sergeant or a lieutenant or a captain from the LE side and some representative, and while speaking of that, that unified command, I also think sometimes people leave out like where you happen to be. If it's a school, you want a school rep in there, the SRO. If you're at BART, you want a BART officer in there. If you're at the airport, you want an airport representative. So there are discipline specific or environment specific people that you would want to have part of that unified command, so they could say, hey, no, that won't work. That they were doing construction there. That road's not open. So you need to send a team in this way, to have some local intel and advice on sort of unifying the mission that you're all trying to do, which is obviously to save lives.
I know you mentioned Urban Shield, and I certainly want to talk about that. But I know that one of the things that I think, are you still involved with Alameda County in emergency preparedness, and to what degree does that cover the things that we've talked about so far?
Well, I mean, I think, as far as our LEMSA, Alameda County EMS agency, I think we're the only LEMSA that actually has a tactical medical program, and I'm the director of that.
That's scary in itself. That's my point. I mean, not that you guys should be feared, but I'm saying that of those many LEMSAs within the state, there's only one that has a tactical medicine program.
And I mean, you can't give credit to just me. There are other strong members as part of our team, but we lived in that other world. I worked with Alameda County Sheriff's Office for decades, and obviously with the FBI and a lot of the law enforcement agencies. So, we're in a unique position where, everybody knows us. It's like, oh, the Alameda County EMS team, they're squared away. And a lot of LEMSAs are regulatory, bureaucratic, policy driven. Not that that's wrong. That's their job. That's their mandated legislative responsibilities. But they maybe don't have the personnel that have the background that many of us do, or like you would have, to say, hey, we're in a unique position here to blend the disciplines. And, we have UASC and SHISHGAP, State Homeland Security grant funding, to outfit law enforcement agencies with tactical medical equipment. Every vehicle in Alameda County that has lights and siren, I mean, whether it's an ambulance, a basic ambulance, a 911 ambulance provider, fire engine, fire apparatus, law enforcement vehicle, BART, ACSO, Oakland PD, every law enforcement vehicle in the country and in our county has a POW kit in there, point of wounding kit, a $600 trauma kit that is multiple tourniquets, multiple chest seals, multiple wound packing, triage tape dispenser, stretcher clipped on, and everybody knows how to use it. And that was 15 years in the making through grant funding. My vision was that every vehicle that sends itself to an active shooter thing, every one of those vehicles has a POW kit in it, and everybody knows how to use it. And so we were in a unique position to kind of leverage those UASC and SHISHGAP grants, and then also provide the training and resupplies for all the law enforcement agencies, fire departments, and ambulance companies in the county. And so, and other counties have copied that. So I like that. That's a great thing to do. And we were in a position to do that as a local LEMSA.
Yeah. And so is there some level, because part of this whole emergency preparedness thing, it has a lot to do with what I like to term as one of the new first responders. And those are just civilians who happen by no other choice, by just virtue of the fact that they're there at a targeted violent event. Does Alameda County ALCO, do they have programs that are geared toward civilians as well?
Yeah, absolutely. And again, we're not the only one. This is becoming much more ubiquitous and universal. And so, and one of the things is everybody's familiar with the run, hide, fight. There are those naysayers that feel like it's not totally valid, until something else comes up. It's not a bad model to train people. So we do we approach this from two different perspectives. One is, if you're a responder, Okay, there's, LE, fire, EMS, whatever. But then if you're in the school or you're in the shopping mall, you're in church or you're at your office or in your hospital and you hear boom, 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 what do you do now? So we've done a ton of those trainings, but we add in help. So it's run, hide, fight, help. And help is just what you're alluding to. And that is stop the bleed, recovery position. It might be, bad guy shooter left the building and you're hearing shots at another, go out to the corridor, grab that person, get them behind cover, start doing first aid, stop the bleed, tourniquet, pressure dressing, just pressure itself, the barehanded or recovery position, or find some way to help. And help might be going out and meeting the law enforcement team rolling in and directing them to where the casualties are. Or it might be giving intel to dispatch over a phone. So initiating the immediate responders is sort of the term that's popular now. Those just happen to be there that are willing to, do something rather than just hide under a desk, which is not a bad thing. But if you're capable and you've got enough, fortitude to say, I want to help, there are many things one can do to help. And so thankfully, we're getting a lot of federal funding and UASI and SHISHGAP funding to support the trauma centers to do more stop the bleed training. So we provide them with the kits that they do the training. And then we do a ton of stop the bleed training for anybody who asks in the county. So as you're right, it's immediate responders are the one who are going to save some lives even before law enforcement gets there and well before a rescue task force gets there.
We've been very fortunate to collaborate with Cal OES and our local fusion center on some grant funding to provide civilian level training in those same areas. I mean, it's good to hear what you said, because then it sounds like we've been doing the right thing. And for the last couple of years, we've been providing those same classes, scenario-based classes for civilians. And I'll tell you, the one thing that I didn't expect to hear from them, because many of the civilians who come into the class come in a little anxious and not certain of what the class is and, how well they'll be capable of responding. And then, once you, sadly, and I do say this in a way that, like, it's sad that we have to do this, but we're almost indoctrinating, our civilian population to be much more aware, to have that situational awareness and mindset and mentality to respond. And again, I agree with you. Hiding is appropriate when it's appropriate, but hiding and then asking and pleading for your life will never be a strategy for survival in my mind. But getting them engaged and teaching them those fundamentals of stop the bleed, of, again, just direct pressure, and then the application of tourniquets and quite honestly, we even tell them, hey, listen, if there's a possibility, get off the X. I mean, if this is where they've been shot, then there may be someone still in the area. Maybe they probably are downrange already, but get to some place with concealed cover and then hide yourself and do whatever is possible to take care of those victims, and then prepare to fight if necessary. But we've created a new round of first responders, a new level of first response that, goes beyond the people who wear badges and carry guns and drive in these fast cars with sirens and ambulances. And I think it's important now for everyone to see that. And I'm glad to hear that you guys do that in Alameda County as well. Is your training based on, is it skills scenario based, or is it more conversational? Which I
have this rule with these kind of trainings. It's less talky, more doey. So we don't even use PowerPoints. So it's I do a quick 3-minute overview of what we're going to cover. It's okay, guys. We're going to get your hands bloody. We break them into groups. And I do what we call, I learned this in my wilderness medicine education training. We call them triple clicks. So you got a group of 24 students. You broke them into 3 groups of 8. They're doing wound packing, SWAT tourniquets, windlass tourniquets. Or if you got more, you got like recovery position, lifts and drags. Spend 10 minutes, click, 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 click. So you click them all around. So as far as the students go, it's like bam, 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 hands on. Then we move to another station, new instructor, bam, bam, bam. And then you wrap it up and you give them they get what I call the 3 C's. They get competence, confidence, and a certification. So I mean, when they walk away with that, they're happy. They get a kit. They feel good about it. They feel empowered. And there were no tests, no lectures, no PowerPoints. Now, granted, there is sometimes they're asking for that. So, there is videos and PowerPoints and all that. But, I mean, I've been an instructor for my entire life, instructor of some capacity or another. And, I learned a long time ago, it's like less talky, more doey. Demonstrate
Sure.
proficiency and pound it, keep it high energy, high impact, captivating, interesting, and boom, 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 boom. And they'll walk away happy.
What do you know of the in terms of preparedness and really prevention, the nationwide suspicious activity reporting initiative, and how everyone can now become much more part of the prevention of targeted violence through just anonymous reporting to a threat center, and being able to run a possible threat, a viable threat.
Yeah, and I think this whole concept of left of boom, has really become more widespread as it should be. And I was involved with the NICRIC as a TLO for many, many years when I was part of the FBI team as well. And I think there was this misbelief that the suspicious activity reporting was something that a TLO did, or law enforcement, or a fire individual, or no, it's really meant to be anybody. And I think that message probably hasn't got out there. And I think that is a gap, because I think educational centers, schools, high schools, whatever, that should be part of their lesson plan. It was interesting. When I grew up, the high school I was in, there were like 400 kids or whatever. And there was 1 or 2 kids I'm going, oh yeah, he's a psycho. I wouldn't doubt if he comes back. There was always 1 or 2.
Yeah.
And I was doing this big exercise at a high school a couple of years ago. I think it was in Newark. I was talking to the school resource officer. I said, hey, you must have like, 1 or 2 kids who you're really worried about. He goes, are you kidding me? There's like 30. I'm like, no kidding. Are you serious? He goes, oh yeah. Kids these days, they are seriously psychotic. And I wouldn't doubt literally if there's a couple dozen that would go off. Okay. That's good to know. Scary as hell, but good to know. And so, those are preventable, because if one of those 24 pops off, there's going to be some people who die from that, and so I think that message of what to look for, what is suspicious activity, what's concerning, what's just merely interesting versus I need to report this. That's, I think, a huge gap. And I'm not sure whose responsibility that is to sort of manifest a lesson plan to get that out to the world. But that is a problem that needs to be solved.
Well, you just mentioned the NICRIC, the Northern California Regional Intelligence Center. Very familiar with them. ISTM operates in the course that we provide for civilians within the CCIC, the Central California Intelligence Center. And as you know, there are 5 of them in the state. All really created as maybe post 9/11 in the prevention of terrorism. And so I think that this concept of TLOs, in which you mentioned for sure. In fact, I went through the TLO course and was designated as an ILO. And so we're seeing that more and more now, where like school officials and business people are now becoming ILOs, and given some access to the the processes for reporting, and maybe even getting some of the intelligence and passing on that intelligence. But I think you hit the nail on the head. I think everyone needs to understand that that we all kind of have a responsibility now. When you're in a school that has 30 possibles, I think the idea is maybe to pass the buck on and let someone else who has a higher level of vetting authority and capability make that decision as to how far they'll go in determining whether that's a viable threat. So much of the time we hear after the fact, like someone says, I knew that they were going to do that.
Yep.
Or they were already, conducting leakage, as it's more commonly referred to, by just posting social media content and making comments in schools, and, just they've done everything but tell the world that they're going to do something. And 30, 40 years ago, we used to just blow those people off. Like, you're just, you're a nut. Um, Seems like it's not a smart idea anymore today, and that it becomes a responsibility of everyone to like, well, the hair on my neck just stood, and maybe I need to say something. It comes down to see something or hear something, say something now. Do you have any? Would you agree, or do you have some thoughts on
Yeah,
that?
100% agree. It was interesting. I went to the Naval Postgraduate School for a master's in Homeland Security, and my thesis, actually, I wish I had changed it, but it was it was sort of the issue at the time, was having EMS personnel in intelligence fusion centers. At that time, in the mid 2000s, there was 26 fusion centers around the country. Now there's way more than that, but none of them had a public health or EMS representative in a intelligence fusion center. And I think that's a gap, not only for the biological, sort of that whole medical realm or chemical or radiological, but also just the EMS side, and empowering, the medical community to be TLOs, whether it's EMS, hospital based, or emergency managers, and just start spreading that word of that. An intelligence fusion center is a welcoming place, not this high security, got to have a clearance access to, but more of a clearinghouse, of an information source to empower the public. Really, like Stop the Bleed should be much like that. Where years ago it was like everybody got CPR trained. That was great. And so we've had great success in pre-hospital or civilian CPR initiation and saving many lives. That same kind of thing is happening with Stop the Bleed, and I think that same thing could happen with earlier recognition of potential threats to nip them in the bud before they become an actual threat.
Absolutely. I think it's just going to continue to grow. We have to stay one step ahead of the threat, and that becomes everyone's responsibility. I want to go back to something that you mentioned, and certainly something that I think you had a big hand in when it was actually being conducted, and that's Urban Shield. For our listeners, because it seems to me that Urban Shield was kind of an Alameda County based program that really had national attention and national recognition. Um, what was Urban Shield, and who was it kind of tailored to, and how was it conducted?
Well, thanks for giving me the opportunity, because Urban Shield was awesome. And it's just a shame that it got flushed down the toilet because of politics. But it actually had its origin with the FBI prior to Urban Shield. We called it the Sierra SWAT Challenge. So it was a SWAT team competition that I was part of with also our team leader, who was an adventure racer. So we would create like a 55-mile course up in the high Sierras with ropes and river crossings and booby trapped landmines that they'd have to go through and terrorist camps that they'd have to do surveillance on, and then assault, and then get in a boat and do, across the lakes, and, and then ascend cliffs. So it was like a 48-hour intense kick your ass kind of, it was like an eco challenge for SWAT teams with stations throughout. And so as, Eddie Fryer, the team leader who was one of my early TLs, was looking to retire, Alameda County Sheriff's Office said, "Hey, this looks great." So we interfaced and overlapped, and then they came up for 2 years and assisted and worked collaboratively with the FBI running SWAT Challenge. And then Sheriff Ahern, I think it was 2006, 2007, said, I think we can get federal money for this if we do it as an urban-based model. And then he had the brilliance to say, let's call it Urban Shield and take that same model of, 20-something SWAT teams rotating through 48 hours through 25 different stations, and just kick their ass for that time frame, keep them up the whole time. And so that was the early origin. So I was, up in the mountains, I was running all the rope sites and I ran all the medical. And then when it came to transition to Alameda County, I ran the rope sites. And then there's a separate group that did sort of the medical evaluations of the SWAT team competitors. So the first few years were very law enforcement focused. They were very tactical in nature, very threat based, simunitions, gunfight, maybe some injuries. And then, thankfully, Sheriff Ahern, said, "Jim, you got a background in this. Can we do some?" So we blended our skill sets, if you will. And so, I did basically the first year, the 2007 or 2008, I can't remember exactly. We did kind of a recreation of Columbine, but we buffed it up where the threats were still viable. So we had a bunch of injuries, and we included fire-based medics and AMR to integrate in after the threat was eliminated. And then that became a model. Not only nationally, we had probably half dozen, maybe 8 different international teams rotate through over the years. At some years there were over 7,000 people involved. It was 9 months of training or planning, and so I would recreate scenarios that were based on real life, the Las Vegas shooting, the Pulse nightclub, the vehicle through a crowd, and sometimes I'd have to buff it up to make it a little more spicy, if you will, or a cult compound kind of thing. And so I had free range and a budget to make these scenarios super hyper realistic. I mean, Hollywood real, with blood pumping systems and good Hollywood moulage. We hired strategic operations to come up and do Hollywood level makeup, and we'd have RPGs blowing stuff up, and lots of gunfights and smoke and everything. So we did really good scenarios, and I was so proud of the team that I worked with, because every year, the sheriff would say, if the governor showed up and said, I got time to go to one scenario, whose scenario they're going to go to? They're going to come to yours, Jim. And so we had a reputation to maintain. So we made sure our scenarios were, everybody walked away going, holy crap, that was awesome. They not only learned something, but they were stressed. They did some interdisciplinary coordination. So it interfaced the law enforcement team with the RTF model before they went into the crisis site. And we had a good run. And unfortunately, the anti-law enforcement folks, I remember, having them behind the curtain, showing what we did, and they were like, oh, you're just exploiting these horrific events for your own benefit. It was like, no, we're really trying to help people be better responders. We had ambulance strike teams involved. We had hospitals set up. So Kaiser's and Stanford would set up emergency departments in a warehouse where we would transfer the patients from the MCI to. It was an incredibly powerful, positive, 12 years of running, or maybe, 2007 to 2018 was the final year we ran it. And it was, the weekend of, it was kind of like the Super Bowl, but it was the 9 months of planning where so many of those relationships were bonded, and developed and trusting. Unfortunately, as we get a little older, half the folks I worked with are now retired. But there's still the folks that remember how powerful an impression that Urban Shield was for both the law enforcement side, the emergency managers, the fire departments all had their zone as well. We did a really good job, and it's just a shame that it got flushed because of politics.
I think, and you mentioned, and absolutely, sadly, politics became part of the problem that ended Urban Shield. But I sometimes feel like as the wave of politics changes, and really the times change, and more dramatic events occur, do you ever foresee or see a time when an Urban Shield or another model like that will reemerge?
Not only could it be, it already has been. So for years, Alameda County Sheriff's Office ran SWAT Challenge. It's kind of a mini Urban Shield. You really can't call it Urban Shield. Okay, fine. So last year, Marin County, San Francisco County, and Alameda County Sheriff's Office jointly, it was run by San Francisco, and they did a great job. 3 counties, I think we had 9 tactical teams rotate through 9 scenarios over 12 hours. So we ran a scenario at the Pleasanton Fairgrounds of a vehicle-borne explosion with follow-on terrorists into the grandstand. But the same kind of thing, a just-in-time training for the fire and private-based and medical practitioners, and rotate through like 9 times. This year, it's called Guardians of the Bay. And this year, the Alameda County Sheriff's Office is the host agency, and it's involving many more counties. I can't remember exactly, 6 or 9 different counties. And it's going to be a 24-hour event that teams will rotate through. And it's not just the tactical teams. They're including, the teams will be made up of half tactical team members, but the other half will be patrol officers, deputies, motors, probation, whatever, that'll rotate as well to give a little more realistic response to, any kind of threat kind of deal. So obviously, it's not the SWAT team that rolls into an active shooters thing. So that'll be in September, late September. So we're in the planning phase for that. And so we've got a great scenario up our sleeve, and I don't want to give it away, but we've got some good stuff planned, and it'll be fun. So it'll be late September, and like I said, it'll be multiple counties, but we'll be running a number of scenarios in Alameda County.
That's fantastic. I'm glad to see that. I mean, glad to see that there's still that type of training that's available and that is being conjured up. The logistics of doing that um, is mammoth. As you already, I don't need to tell you. I mean, and you said, you guys were working on Urban Shield for 9 months prior to it, being delivered. Um, do you think that today, with the level of training that does occur versus um, what needs to occur, um, is kind of somehow and sadly watered down because um, a lot of agencies in their quest to check a box and just be compliant with things will create some level of training that is almost a conversation as opposed to strong hands-on scenario based realistic or even in your case hyper realistic type training is what you are providing there in Alameda County just kind of a one off because what you see at the local levels and certainly what I see at the local levels doesn't necessarily meet a standard of training that will be sufficient for officers to be competent across everything, including not only in response, but also maybe even the medicine side of response.
Yeah, I mean, you bring up a great point, and there's certainly mandated qualifications and training that have to happen. But I think the good thing is so many of the local law enforcement agencies, when they're doing CQB training with deputies or whatever, they're including some degree of operator or officer down or innocent subject being hit by stray gunfire. So that can happen at a localized level. And one of the articles I wrote, it was probably 10 plus 12 years ago. I wrote an article on, I think it was an EMS one and police one, on how do you actually plan an MCI training, multidiscipline, and I'm not super rigid by the book, but it was sort of like 9 months out, you need to get these people together, and you got to have representation from the different disciplines, including the host agency, the school, whatever, where you're going to be doing it. Then 6 months out, you got to have, the plan for what you're trying to do. And then I looked at some ratios, how many officers are you looking there? How many engine companies you're looking to roll in? And that can balance with how many patients you want to have when you're creating the scenario. And so you can do it, kind of piecemeal, but it really has to be an interdisciplinary coordination thing. You can't have it strictly on the LE side or the fire side or the EMS side. It has to be, a triad plus some representation from, BART, if you happen to be doing it there, whatever, pick a discipline or an environment. Um, and then that team, almost like a 4-person team, has got to really be coordinated by themselves and integrate the right people and planning. And that you got to have some budget to it as well. It doesn't have to be much. People don't have to, you don't have to pay role players, for example, but you've got to get them lined up way ahead of time. You got to, and really role players are huge. They want to, we make sure that the role players are sometimes we'll even do like stop the bleed training for them while people are getting set up so that they're doing something,
Sure.
and they get a kit and they
Good.
like it, and we make sure they're fed. We make sure they're well taken care of. We make sure that, they get some kind of certificate or t-shirt or something, they're congratulated at the end. But you got to think about all that stuff, months and months ahead of time. And it doesn't have to be large scale. That article is probably looking at, one of these big scenarios with 25 injuries and 5 critical and 5 minors, et cetera, et cetera. But, you can dial it back down to something much more manageable and within budget. And I know the fire department, sometimes it's hard to say, hey, next month we'd like you to rotate through on this. And, their training is booked out a year ahead of time. So, you've got to throw something way down the calendar. And, just like we saw at Urban Shield, the SWAT challenge or everything else, you throw it way down the calendar before you know it is there. And there's about 150 things that have to happen between now and then. And, my rule has always been do what you can, when you can, as early as you can, and then check that box so it's done. And then you move on to the next need to do item to get prepared for the event.
And I think that the need to ensure that that training, whatever it um, is quality training that
Hmm.
that really kind of puts people in a position. I like to say, hey, listen, we need to make you comfortable in being when you get uncomfortable, and
Hmm.
you know, it takes that opportunity to a level where you have to put them in situations where again there's stress inoculation and auditory exclusion, all the things that lend themselves to like making it a little more challenging for you and requiring you to become much more capable of doing things under stress where so much of the time, I mean, and maybe it's just the stuff that I'm seeing that it is partly because you have staffing issues and budget issues and everything else that goes on. The number of things that need to be trained. It's almost like we've reached a point of not only saying that we're going to do more with less, but now we're doing almost less with less.
Hmm. Hmm.
Um, and so I think it's important, and you bring a good point in the things that you say. When you can, if you can, you need to do these things. Um, do you find resistance when you talk to, administrators? Do they come up with a number of different reasons why they can't, or are they kind of on
No,
board?
I think as long as you're not forcing anything down their throat, understanding that it is in their best interest and it's in the patient care interest, and you give them enough time to digest the concept, and incrementally move towards that goal that you're looking towards. I think most people are okay with that. I have not run into significant resistance. A lot of times it's hard to find the right place to do it. I mean, we have a whole cache of training supplies, and there are some places where they say, Jim, you can do whatever you want, simunitions, you can have blood in the place, we're going to be raising that building, so make a mess. I know real life is messy. I go, yahoo, let's go for it. Then other places are like, Jim, you cannot leave a drop of blood. When you leave here, this place needs to be just like you found it. I go, oh man, but we can do that. We have these resin blood puddles that look like real blood puddles, and we have we don't do the blood pumping system. We put a little what we call smeary blood, so it looks a little wet. We make sure that we prepare the loading zone so that nobody's going to get in trouble. So making sure that people are going to not get stressed, or we're not going to stress the situation or the environment that we're doing. We're not going to fail people. We're not looking to nuke people and just be an evaluator. That's the other kind of concept I think is worth addressing. I never liked exercises where the evaluator was quiet with a checkboard, just looking and making notes, and then evaluating them at the end, saying, okay, you did this well, you did this wrong. Why did you do this? Da, da, da. That is a horrible way to do an exercise. We flip that paradigm around 100%, where we have mentor guides escorting the medical team into the environment. And so they are guiding them, just saying, okay, remember high and tight, high and tight. Okay, there you go. You got it. Like helping them succeed. That's the opportunity the right teachable moment is right there in the spot. Even if they do it, okay, guys, timeout, stop action. Okay, hold on here. Okay, TL, you were doing this, but remember your job is this. Da, 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 da. Okay, everybody good? All right, back at it. So taking that moment to make it a more positive learning experience and not an evaluation goes a long way to having people buy into what it is you're trying to do.
Absolutely. I'm a big fan of a term that I've heard a few times and now I've stolen. In when conducting training, taking that tactical pause, and when you see something wrong, whether it be in a group of people who are in a movement, moving down a hall, maybe in an entry, or and again when you've reached the point of now providing medical care, you know, stopping them at that moment to fix it, because what I've learned over time is that when you wait to discuss it in a debrief and a hot wash, you never really address it. You only address it verbally. And so they never get the opportunity to actually hands on see what the mistake was and then kind of correct it so that it becomes now part of their muscle memory. Um, and I think you're kind of mentioning it in a similar way, like talking about it later doesn't necessarily solve it. All you've really done is identify what they did wrong, but never gave them the opportunity to fix it.
And that's not to say, I mean, I have this video, which, of one of the scenarios we did where there was a junctional hemorrhage with a blood pumping system. So there's blood pumping out of a downed operator, and the rescuing operator came in and there's blood everywhere. And so I saw what he was doing. He was actually putting a tourniquet on, but he put it on the wrong leg. And so I actually let that go for a little while, and he put the tourniquet on. And then I just reached down and I pulled the flap of where the hemorrhage was coming from, the other side in the junctional. And he went, oh, shit, and he got his hand in there, and just and he was sort of like, now what do I do? And it was sort of like, okay, basically you are going to be in that position all the way to the hospital. You don't have a junctional tourniquet. Your hand is the junctional tourniquet. Is it working? He goes, yeah, it's working. Okay. So, after the end, during the debrief, he goes, I'll never make that mistake again. I will open. So, there's a hard lesson learned too. Like, and I haven't even shown anybody that video because it's really like, oh my God, he kind of blew it. He put a tourniquet on the wrong leg, and the blood squirting out of the other side, but the lesson learned, was a forever lesson for him. I have no doubt this individual, and he runs into the real crazy stuff that he may into in the future, he's going to take the pause to find out where that bleeding's coming from and do the right thing.
And again, you just drive home the strongest point in putting people in those situations, and then maybe taking the opportunity to show them the mistake at the time of the mistake, and and I don't even really want to call it a mistake, just some correction. Certainly, I think when you have people who are not comfortable and familiar with that level of medicine, the notion of the things that we tell them to do just, like blows their minds. Putting your finger directly into to try to stop a bleeder that can't be accessed through tourniquet use or otherwise, is really enlightening to people when you train them that way. And those are the types of things that I think that can only be trained in a scenario-based environment, which, it sounds like that you guys do over there. I think really, I mean, it's certainly always been in my mind that ALCO has always been kind of at the forefront of a lot of things. I always, I wonder, like, okay, like you've been in place there for quite some time. Is there someday we all have an expiration date? What's the future of guys like you? Guys, leaders who are now going to take the torch and carry it, down the road further. In Alameda County, or even, would you say, even in the industry as a whole?
Yeah. And I think, that whole TEMS model, that's a good resource for folks to evolve, especially, and I don't even know if I brought this up, but I was a cop in Maine for a while, and I was at that fork in the road. Am I going to be a cop or a medic? And it was just too much to remember to do both. So I shifted to medicine, but especially those individuals that have at least a strong appreciation for one discipline, but live in another. And if they're equally experienced in both, those are the right people that, really, I can walk into LE and I got creds, it's like, yeah, Morrissey squared away, and so it's the person, and we're developing that new generation of people who are developing that credibility and that reputation for being squared away, for being, good educators, for being aware of the disciplines and everything that everybody brings. I'm optimistic. I love my job. I have great support with my leadership. We have a great team at ALCO EMS, and I'm not going anywhere anytime soon. I love what I do. But you're right that there is some transition that has to happen. Much like, I was mentioning with ACSO, half the guys and gals I worked with Urban Shield are retired now. So there's a new generation that are learning well. And I think, it was just so interesting to see the evolution over the 12 years of Urban Shield, of when the teams were really focusing on just threat elimination as it evolved over time, really understanding the medical care. And I mean, I remember some teams would have the patients all wrapped up, all the tourniquets, chest seals were on, triage tape was all there. And when the medical team went in, they just got directed. Okay, all the reds are over there, all the yellows are there. Like, it was all done. It's like, that's perfect. That's what I want to see. And I
Yeah.
think there are people that are learning those lessons that you and I are trying to share and trying to implore these people to absorb. And I think they'll be ready when the time comes.
Do you think that's the underestimated and maybe not often examined piece in this response is, the best deployment of a mass casualty event where a warm zone, cold zone, CCP is conducted and getting that whole process correct?
Yeah, and I think those terms are around for a reason. They make sense. Whether it's direct threat or, hot zone, whatever you want to call it, and there's some, medical consensus of what should and shouldn't be done there. The same with warm zone or indirect. So I think there's, the TECC model, the Committee on Tactical Emergency Care is doing a great job of, really outlining the right basic life support interventions and the advanced life support interventions that are appropriate depending on the environment that you're in. And so the medicine's solid. I think that the mission is now to disseminate that amongst the workforce so that people know it's, oh, hey, now it's 2 grams of TXA. We're doing an IV push and not, another way around. So staying up, medicine is always changing. I mean, I put mask pants on people. I'm sure you have as well,
Yes.
and, so
I wish they, I mean,
yeah, I saw blood pressures go up. I did.
So when you get them to
but,
the ER, then all of a sudden things start going badly when people just rip them off.
exactly.
Or cut them off, even worse.
Of course. So, medicine changes. Medicine is dynamic. There's always research being done. As long as we stay a student and we're open for learning new and being open for ideas that totally contradict what we believe for many, many years, then we're going to be heading in the right direction.
Yeah. You have a background, and you mentioned it. You have a master's degree in Homeland Security, although you said you would have considered something else otherwise. But that you studied in that. What are your current thoughts as it relates to our current terrorist threat environment that we live in today?
Well, not really involved. I lost my security clearance after the Bureau cut us off. The NICRIC and getting bulletins, and I am on the personal list of folks to get intel if it's appropriate. It's interesting with the Super Bowl. I was deployed with the FBI SWAT team as a medic for Super Bowl 50. And then this last one, just a few months ago, I deployed with our mass casualty incident bus, standing by with SWAT teams and bomb squads and drone interdiction teams and hazmat teams, ready to respond. So, I think, the threat environment is real. And thankfully, our intel organizations are squared away and dialed and picking up on those and have, stopped plenty of potential activities. And as long as they're disseminating that information to the right people, which I think they've done a good job of, I have no real complaints with the Bureau, the NICRIC, the STAC, or whatever intel centers are keeping an eye on those things so that not everybody has to. And as long as they're sharing that intel, we're in the FIFA, craziness right now. So, I'm involved in a EMS subcommittee dealing with potential, mutual aid if need be for some of the matches that are going on. And I think, we've learned a lot, over the last 30 years or since 9/11, and the interdisciplinary coordination is much better than it's ever been. I think those cylinders, those silos, or some people call them cylinders of excellence, are identified and questioned. I think we're at a much better place where information is getting out to the folks that need it.
And do you see though that the threat level has evolved to a point where it's almost hard to keep up with it? And so I read and then saw a story on the threat that was averted in DC during that UFC fights that were going on there, and how the FBI had thwarted a possible terrorist threat against the event. And when you think about the types of threat capabilities that are out there now, especially when we're talking about drone systems and what have you, how much more difficult it is not only to be able to identify, but then to be able to combat them. where you might be used to a person. This new level of asymmetrical attacks are just so far fetched to me. I mean, do you have any thoughts on how much worse this can get, or are we just
Yeah, and
kind of
actually,
reaching
yeah,
a
I
new
mean,
point?
I loved my experience at the Naval Postgraduate School. When I was my thesis, I probably would have rather have focused more on rescue task force kind of things, but at that point, I was involved with the NICRIC, and I wanted more EMS representation. So it was an incredible opportunity. And I think the unfortunately, the FBI has shifted, the recent politics and whatnot. There's a lot of my colleagues who I work with in the FBI are really dejected as to what's going on now. There are others that are quite happy. So there is a change in posture. And I'm not really in that world anymore. Other than, when I did go to school, there was hybrid targeted violence, which was a term that really looked at things like the Nice attack in France, the Paris attack, the Mumbai attack in Kenya, where it's really dedicated threats or terrorists are training. They are quite capable. They're military savvy. They're well armed and well organized. They're hitting multiple places at the same time. Those are scary as hell. And I've always said what happens in the Middle East eventually happens in Europe, and it happens in Europe eventually happens here. So we really haven't had a big dose of a hybrid targeted attack, but it's probably just a matter of time. But I think everybody's aware that that is a threat. And as you mentioned, drones are sort of the weapon of choice for these kinds of things. And, when you got 15 drones heading at you, it's time. You can't shoot them all down. I am merely a spectator at this point in my career and an observer or an absorbing information that is passed to me and appropriately postured to respond with our guidance and whatnot, mutual aid. So, it is real. It is a threat, and hopefully our intel community can thwart those before they become a real issue.
And so when you look at all of it and the response, the total response, and what's your current assessment of tactical medicine today versus even 10 years ago?
Well, I think the self-care buddy care is definitely where it should be, so that every officer, deputy, has the ability to take care of their own injuries or fellow officers. So that I think is it at a level of solid competence where that wasn't the case 10 years ago. And I think we're still in this transition phase of shifting from threat identification and neutralization, to casualty care. There are some teams or some LE departments that get that, some are not. And so that's a gap that still needs to be fixed. And I think, the TEMS evolution, whether it's fire-based or private-based or contractor-based, is also heading in the right direction. As you pointed out earlier, it'd be nice to see some consistencies between the different groups and policies and trainings and expectations. But, you only have so much influence in your own jurisdiction. You cannot change somebody else's decisions based on your opinion. So, but it's better than it was 10 years ago. It's much more squared away. I know at least I can speak for the Alameda County TEMS team. They are able to respond to every request by every law enforcement agency in Alameda County and also the feds. So whether it's DEA, Homeland Security, or BART or whatever, they're able to pony up a TEMS team to support that law enforcement operation, whether it's spontaneous or planned. So I'm really proud that they can confidently say they will get some bodies there in a timely manner.
Any advice for EMTs? I use you and I as an example. I don't know. I don't know about you, but when I became an EMT and then a medic, I never could have foreseen where the road that I would be traveling down and the things that I would be doing. Um, and so I'm sure you probably had some similar thoughts yourself. Any advice for the current level of EMT and paramedics who are considering a more expanded role in tactical medicine?
Yeah, and I even expand that further. When I'm training a bunch of relatively new EMS medical providers, my advice to them is find something that needs some work. That you have an interest in. Maybe it's pediatric intubation. Maybe it's brain injuries, or maybe it's smoke inhalation, maybe it's, jellyfish envenomation. I don't care. Pick something, and do your research on it, and then, do a little in-service for your department or your agency, and then, we used to have the Bay Area Journal Club where people would present, on their articles that they've written, and then before you know it, you become, kind of an expert in that field. Maybe it's on CO poisoning for firefighters, whatever. Like I said, it doesn't matter. And pick something either you're interested in or really scared of. Like I hated 12 leads, I still can't figure them out. But, somebody could like tackle something they're uncomfortable with and get really good at it. And before you know it, you'll be an expert. Before you know it, you'll be writing articles. Before you know it, you'll be writing peer-reviewed articles. Then you'll be asked to present at conferences. Then you become a national expert, and, in a way, I kind of did that with tactical medicine. I found an interest, I had an opportunity, and, I've been an educator, so I know how to share that information. And so it's really do your homework, stay humble. You're not the expert. You got to get 50 years under your belt before you can even somebody else consider you that. And just keep on learning at every opportunity. And you got to be open to change. And even I know there's some rescue task force models that are suggesting getting rid of ballistic protection. Helmets, and it's just slowing them down, and it's not really protecting them any. And, the risk is very low. So let's just get in there and move bodies. It's like moving furniture. We got to go to work, get these people out. Okay. That's not how I felt 10 years ago, but now I'm like, no, I actually kind of get that, so you got to be able to challenge some beliefs that you've had for years and years and years. And just be patient. The FBI, picked me. I didn't pick them. When we brought on other medics, there are plenty of medics, as I'm sure you could appreciate. Hey, I'd love to be a medic on the FBI SWAT team. Of course you would. What could be a more badass job than that,
Yeah.
But no, you don't pick them. They pick you, And so it's being kind of the quiet, solid, square operator, having your kit together, being humble, being, the last person to leave, first person to show up, always willing to help out, always willing to learn. Those are the individuals that will get spotted and say, "Hey, Bobby, how'd you like to come plug in with us?" And they'd be honored to do so. So those are the pathways that lead to good tactical medics: being squared away and humble, and having your own thing, being fit, being squared away, having your gear together, and not being that guy needing stuff. Has anybody got an extra this? You don't want to be that guy. You want to be first up, ready to go, and having your act together. And I always prided myself on that.
I think you and I both started off as medics. And of course you had this background in wilderness medicine as well, which, even makes it, proves my point more, is, being versatile and having other feathers you can put in your cap makes your career go so much faster and better. And what I see today in EMS is that EMS operators are being pigeonholed into the work that they do and finding themselves reaching that level of burnout so much faster because they could never imagine doing anything else. And they get caught up in what they are currently doing. And then, there are always certain avenues where, like, most medics would go into nursing, likely, or into fire service. And those are, can be a little challenging as well, but doing something different and being available and open to it is so important, which, again, maybe it's a combination of luck or skill or whatever. But I think you're a perfect example, and maybe me to a lesser degree, I would say, in finding other opportunities to use what you have gained in a skill set to further your career and provide a higher level of service to a community or even a large organization. And that's certainly what you have been able to do. And I think it's a kind of a shining star, because I don't think there can be thousands of Jim Morrisseys out there. I mean, you're only going to have so many people who can do that, but there's always another opportunity to do other things. And I think today the role of a paramedic is so much more expansive than it was 25 or 30 years ago when you and I, first started. I went through paramedic school in 1981, and I just thought I was going to be either a firefighter or a nurse. And lo and behold, I mean, there's just so many other things to do. And I think you've been fortunate enough to, like I said, be in the right place at the right time, but also have a willingness to maybe engage in different things, which is not commonly seen today. Um, I want to thank you, Jim, for joining us on Life on the X today. Is there anything that you would like to close with that maybe a special nugget that will send us off here today?
Well, I tell you, over the years, as I'm sure you've experienced, I started out with a big ALS pack on my back, and over the years, that got smaller and smaller because everybody's got tourniquets, and really my kit became more of a pharmaceutical kit, Claritin and Pepto-Bismol and ibuprofen. And, a training that I think a lot of TAC medics could benefit from is actually a wilderness medicine course. You learn all about environmental medicine, orthopedic injuries, the things that really happen to people: poison ivy, poison oak, blisters, sprained ankles, heat exhaustion, sunburn. Those are the things that happen to operators, and so, that skill set has come way more frequently apparent compared to tactical medicine. Granted, you want to have a solid tactical medical background, but understanding environmental medicine and taking a wilderness first responder course will greatly expand your knowledge base and skill set. And you're really a general practitioner when you're a medic attached to a team. Not so much a TEMS medic or RTF, but if you're embedded with the team, you're the team doc. You're going to deal with everything from slivers of steel in their eye from shooting steel to, just headaches and, sore throats and ear infections and, all the things that happen to humans, one
of the things that I used to carry with the teams I travel with, common issue was the need for Imodium.
Totally. Absolutely. Yep. Belly butt meds are, and really, much like nursing care, eating and drinking and peeing and pooping are really important to keep an eye on.
Yeah.
Yep.
Totally.
So anyway, that'd be big advice. Take a wilderness med course that'll enhance and fill out your skill set even more so.
Tell us a little bit about your tactical medicine guide. Field guide.
Okay. So it was actually based on the Wilderness Medicine Guide that I wrote in 1997, where there have been over 150,000 copies made, translated into 10 different languages. So the idea back then was to take everything you could think of, altitude, 1 page, lightning, 1 page, ticks, 1 page, belly pain, 1 page. So pick the spectrum of everything that could happen to us, and you get 1 page for each. And so that was the origin of the Tactical Medicine Guide. So about 60% of the Wilderness Guide is in the TAC Med Guide, plus, of course, the tactical medicine specific things that we all know and we all teach. But as I said earlier, it's been 10 years. The TECC guidelines are updated now. There's definitely some changes that need to happen. So we're in the process of doing the second edition of the TechMed Field Guide, which will be a more condensed, a little bit bigger font as well, a little more illustrations. It'll be printed on waterproof paper. And so it should be available within 6 months. And as I mentioned earlier, we're looking to release it as an app as well, which should be, again, 6 or 8 months out, and we'll have something ready to go. So hopefully it'll be something you find valuable and, people use as a, I find a lot of people who have used it for a lot of the minor stuff. It's like I show how to do a really good ankle evaluation to determine if you need to go get x-rays or not. That's a common thing you're going to end up dealing with. Or dislocation reductions for certain dislocations makes sense. Certain medicines for over-the-counter kinds of things. So just a lot of the common, routine, non-life-threatening things that a medic is asked to deal with on a regular basis.
Is your guide available through Amazon or some other platform?
Yep. Through Amazon, also Conterra-Inc.com. So a lot of the gear that I work with my partner, Rick Lipke, who we've invented a lot of gear together. He and I taught at the FBI Academy together. So it's available. He was actually the publisher of the TechMed Guide with me. So it is available on Amazon. It's a good guide. I will admit there's definitely a lot of stuff that has to be updated. But another 6-8 months, we'll have a second edition out.
And certainly, as you mentioned, an app is like right here, right on my phone, and you've got it right with you all the time. I mean, you might forget your field guide, but you'll never forget your phone.
Yeah, absolutely. You know,
That's for
quick little
sure.
story. I was traveling across Tanzania doing a walking safari, you know, and the guides are there. They go, "What's your last name?" I was like, "Morrissey." He goes, he went to his Land Rover, pulled out his med kit, and he pulled out a first aid, one of my wilderness first aid guides that he had with him that somebody had used as a teaching guide in Africa. I was like, "That's awesome. That makes me happy."
Did you autograph it? I'm sure he wanted
Of
your
course I
autograph.
did. Of course I did.
Absolutely. Wow. I mean, when you've got international fame, that's pretty good. All started from being a medic in Maine.
There you go. Yep, it's true.
How does if possible, if you'd like, how does anyone get a hold of you?
Medic Morrissey at Gmail. So
Very
Medic
good.
Morrissey, one word. And that's yep. Medic
And we'll make
Morrissey
sure
at Gmail.
to tag that into this podcast. Excellent. Well, listen again. Thank you so much for being with us on Life on the X. What a phenomenal experience to talk with you. I mean, I always think I've been around a while, but then you know, it's so great to meet someone who A, has been around a little bit longer, but B, more importantly, is still heavily involved and still contributing, you know, to both the tactical medicine world and just the world in general. And so you know, you're a real pioneer, Jim, and it is a pleasure to know you and certainly to have you on the show. I hope you'll come back again.
Well, Will as well. And I have to give kudos to you, Sal, for, you know, really taking ISTM and bringing it to a new level and just getting that information to the world, including the public offerings you're doing. So, you know, I'm super proud to be connected with you and you've done a great job and your team is awesome. And anything we can do to support and encourage people to plug in, we'll do as much as we can. Thank you.
Well, I certainly hope to have you come and join us at some point here when you can find the time.
There you go. I'd love to.
Okay, excellent. Well, thank you so
All
much,
right.
and we will see you downrange.
All right. Thank you, Sal.
Take care.